So without further ado, I'll hand us over to Kim.
Was anyone here in the fabulous storytelling session? Give me a show of hands if you're in the storytelling session. Yeah. So I was in that session, and while I was in that session, I had the absolute pleasure of sitting next to and meeting Troy, who's here. Look, I put you on the spot, Troy. And what happened was we were asked to share a story with the person next to us. And Troy was sitting next to me, and Troy and I shared a story, and we hadn't really said anything more than, oh, hello, prior to that. And then there was this moment of connection, right? And everything sort of changed. Suddenly the audience was a part of the conversation. And so I'm going to ask you to turn and meet someone right now, because this is the last session of the day. And what I found when I met Troy was that, you know, he told a story about being in the Navy in New Zealand. I told a story about being an activist with Greenpeace. But we also found throughout those stories we had an incredible amount in common. And I walked away from that conversation just kind of going, oh, those connections are what make these conferences so powerful. So I want to give you another opportunity to find one of those magical connections. So please turn and meet someone, let them know who you are, where you're from, and tell them what has been the most interesting thing or person that you have met today. All right. They're quick connections. We're speed dating here. So let's come back all together as a whole group. And I'm really interested to know who we have in the room today. So give me a show of hands if you are in a paid role. Yeah? And keep your hands up as if as part of that role, you look after volunteer recruitment for your organisation. Yeah. And do we have any volunteers in the room as well? And you can all wear multiple hats. I know that's who we are, us lot. And so is anyone a volunteer that looks after volunteer recruitment as part of their role? Yeah. Often in rooms, I find that people are putting their hands up for all of this stuff. Because what we know to be true in our not-for-profit space is that we all wear many hats. And that things cross over. So I was just talking to Michael, who was talking about how down at the peninsula in Flinders where he lives, people are part of the Lions Club. They're also part of the Sailing Club and Rotary, and they're crossing over many spaces. Sometimes this can be seen as a bad thing. Sometimes it could be seen as a good thing. In my experience, it's neither. It's just all about our perspective. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story about how I came to be presenting around volunteer recruitment. In my early 20s, I worked for Greenpeace. And as part of that 10-year journey, I spent several years overseas. And initially I went overseas and I worked in America. It was post 9/11, Bush administration. Greenpeace was hemorrhaging money, hemorrhaging supporters, and activists were being locked up indefinitely. And I went over there to rebuild Greenpeace USA. I was charged with starting up a grassroots activism movement and reinvigorating and bringing their face-to-face fundraising in-house. So large-scale engagement and recruitment. And one of the things that was really interesting, not just in America, but in my time working with Greenpeace all around the world, was that Greenpeace had an average volunteer age of just 23. And then Black Saturday happened. I was really exhausted from travelling for 4 years and not having a home. Black Saturday happened. I had a lot of family and friends deeply affected, and I came home with the direct intention to work in fire recovery. And I found myself with land care. So Landcare had an average volunteer age of 65. And what I found was that there was this narrative that was happening with Landcare. Do I have any Landcare people in the room? No. I'm going to recruit you all by the end of this. No, I'm kidding. What I found was that there was a real narrative with Landcare, and it was that young people don't care about the environment, we can't get them to volunteer, and the world is screwed because when we all die, no one's going to take over. But of course, I just recruited 4,000 volunteers who were in their early 20s. And so I knew this wasn't true. And so what I did was I set out to smash that paradigm. How do you create the bridge between what is and what people think there is? And so I started to design a program for Landcare that would directly bring in the young people. And Landcare for Singles was born. It's now a national program that has recruited thousands of volunteers and a few babies, a few marriages, but essentially it was meeting the young people that they desired where they were at. And so sometimes it's about the program design itself. So what I then did was I looked over the next few years at all of the volunteer recruitment I was doing and what was successful about it. And I started to break it down. I discovered there was a recipe, and that's how I ended up training volunteer recruitment. So I'm going to go through a really short presentation for you today. Hopefully there's a few tips, tools and tricks that you can take away, or maybe just some insight and inspiration. So first of all, is recruitment the answer to our problems? Sometimes volunteer recruitment can feel like a bit of a golden bullet. So the biggest challenges that all of our small not-for-profits, medium not-for-profits face is we don't have enough money, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough people. If only we just had more people, everything would be fine. But what actually happens when we recruit? More expectations. So people have expectations of our community group. People have expectations of our organisations. More diversity, which means we need to play more hats to tailor to all of this diversity in our organisations. More roles, more admin, more coordination. It's more work. The more people we bring on, the more work we create. And this is so common. But if burnout is your issue, is recruitment really the answer? And I really say it's not. So you need to make sure that organisations are resourced to take on the work before they bring more people on. So I understand if you want to get up and leave now. Maybe I've scared you all off. Everyone's ready to lash. Yes?
Sorry, when you say your organisation resource, it's
Yeah.
not about recruiting. What sort of resourcing?
So the more people we have, the more work we create. And quite often recruitment can be done just as kind of this ad hoc thing. We need more people, let's make a flyer, put up a flyer. People ring or the phone never rings. And if we don't take a planned approach, we just end up losing those people. And particularly in scenarios where we have volunteers recruiting volunteers, it's really disheartening. And so we want to make sure that we're getting a return on investment for our time. And to do that, I advocate to take 3 steps back and take a really planned approach to it. We'll get more into that in a bit. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. All right, so let's just have a little look at what's happening before we dig into that planned process. So modern day volunteering. Volunteering is increasing year on year. So of people who recruit volunteers here, who feels like it's a super competitive space? Does it feel like it's getting harder? Yeah, yeah. So the reality is that every year, more and more people volunteer. It doesn't always feel like that because we're sitting behind our desks or we're sitting out there in the community trying to get people on board, and we're the ones continuously asking and sometimes getting no. Of course that happens. And so it can feel like it's getting harder, but the reality is that every year there are more volunteers in the potential volunteer pool. So we're due for a census this year, so these stats are slightly out of date, but in 2016, the census from the year before told us that there was near on 2% of the population who volunteered. 2011, the previous census, it was less than 1%. So we had an extra over 500,000 volunteers in the potential pool. And that trajectory has continued year on year. So I'm really interested to see next year what happens when we get our census stats back. So there is a trend towards more volunteers wanting roles that are more flexible or requiring shorter hours or shorter term commitment. So we know, right, we're all busy. We live in busy times. And volunteering is competing with greater work and caring responsibilities. So to be able to appeal to a broader range of people, sometimes we just need to rethink what we're asking them to do. Traditionally, volunteer roles have been very, that you're on the roster every week, the kind of op-shop model. And we're really taking a shift away from that now because the market is demanding the shift. Employee volunteering. This is my favourite thing at the moment. So how's this? 70% of businesses now have a volunteering program. Does that shock anyone? Yeah, when I first read this, I was astounded. So Volunteering Australia brought out this research a couple of years ago, and I was floored by it. I couldn't believe that we had reached 70%. What's really exciting about this is 50% of the allocated hours within these employee volunteering programs remain unworked. Means that is not being taken up. So that's 500 full-time equivalent employees left on the table every year. It's 20 million hours per week, 20,000 hours per week, and over 1 million hours a year, just there for the taking. So why do we have this situation? It's twofold. One is that employees are not taking up the opportunity within their organisations, which to me screams opportunity. Like as organisations, we're not appealing to them enough. We could inspire them more to take action. The second part of this story is that it can be really hard to work with corporate volunteers. Has anyone done it? Yeah, is it tough?
It can be.
Yeah, it can be really hard. These businesses have expectations and they have needs that we need to pivot and adapt to as organisations to be able to do it well. And sometimes it gets a little bit too hard basket. And sometimes it's that our organisations aren't resourced to meet their needs. But still for me, I think there is a massive space of potential here that we are not tapping into. So let's have a quick look at the changes and what's happening. So people, how are they volunteering? There's the on-site and the remote piece now. So on-site, pretty straightforward. They come to your place, your organisation's home base, they volunteer, or remotely, which is growing a lot. People working online behind the scenes. So people volunteer one-off, ongoing, or on a project base. And people are volunteering still as individuals or as groups. And this group space is growing exponentially with some of those demands of the employees. Like they want a place 10 employees for a day in a single space. And we all go, what are we going to do with 10 people all at once? And we have to have toilets for them, and we have to feed them, and do you have any budget? And then the businesses go, no budget. I think there's room for negotiation there though. So volunteering variety. These are some of the ways people come to volunteer. So we have the employee volunteers, university talent hubs. If you're not tapped into these yet, it is a really good source of volunteers. So these are your students who are working often in cross-functional teams to deliver projects largely for community-based organisations. And you can get some really nice chunky pieces of work done through this. The quality can be up and down. You can't just let them run free. You need to manage them and give them really clear boundaries and feedback. But to get things off your plate, to get project planning done, it's a really amazing source of volunteers. So mutual obligation. Mutual obligation now sees through Centrelink. So if you're between 60 and 65, in order to get your pension, you need to volunteer 15 hours per, is it week or fortnight? It's, you don't think it's volunteering?
Well, yeah, we have people.
Yeah. So I would class it as volunteering. I used to work for Eastern Volunteers, and we had, which is one of the small subsets of Volunteering Victoria, and as part of that support service, we would take a lot of those people from Centrelink and place them in the community. I totally hear you that it can be seen either way, but I guess what I would say is that my experience of dealing with a lot of these people is that they're going out into the community to volunteer, but they're doing it under an iron fist, right? They're doing it because they have to. I believe that this provides an amazing opportunity for us as organisations to create really engaging, tailored programs to these people, because they need to do the hours, and we want these positions that they do to be really fulfilling for them. And I've seen some incredible relationships built up between organisations and people who initially start out on mutual obligation and continue with that organisation for a long period of time, because the organisation meets that person where they're at and creates a role or a set of activities that work really well for that person. So referred by a friend, this is absolutely still the most common way that people come to volunteering roles. We'll come back to it. So saw a request online. This is growing more and more, particularly if you're building an audience as an organisation. And we've had plenty of presentations here today that talked about the need for engaging in that digital space. But once you have that audience and they know, like, and trust you, being able to then put that call to action out, or that ask for volunteer time, once you've got the audience there. Parental responsibility, you know this is the sports clubs, this is school. You say, I'm not going to join the PTA of that school, not going to do it, and then all of a sudden you find yourself, at the school council meeting. Needing to gain skills to manage life scenarios. So we're starting to move a little bit with these last two into more motivations for volunteering, but bear with me, there's a reason why. So this one here is really around things like, so I've got a parent who's aging and I don't know how to deal with this situation. So I might go and volunteer with a respite organisation to gain those skills to help my parents. More and more common, it's a huge growth space as we have an ageing population and more elderly people staying in their homes longer. The other one is moral obligation. So this is the tipping point, right? You might have been there yourself. It's that point where you're like, I can no longer sit back and do nothing. And this is where we see real spikes in volunteer uptake. So, I've got a little quiz for you. Raise your hand if you think you know one of the 2 spikes that we've had in volunteering in the last 12 months. What events were they? Yay.
The fires.
Absolutely. I have a little prize for you.
We needed a word. I was going to tell the volunteer.
We're getting to that point, aren't we, people? There's another one. What do you think the other spike was? Yes? So when did they see their big spike? That's absolutely it. Election. Okay. Yeah. So after the election, yeah. I don't have any more. Don't jump me. After the election, we saw this huge spike because a certain portion of the population saw this as the climate election. And once the result didn't turn out how many people thought it would, there was a sense of despair. We saw it with the bushfires as well, and people become morally obliged to jump into action. 38 inquiries post-election came into my inbox. 38 people, unprompted, saying, Kim, I need to do something. Where should I volunteer? When I was the community engagement manager at Eastern Volunteers, we used to have 30 to 50 people walk through our doors every single week saying, I need to volunteer. I want to volunteer. I'm retiring. I'm ready to give back. I'm a student. I need to gain work experience. 30 to 50 people a week saying, Kim, where can I volunteer? So it's like this massive river that runs between the 2 sides of the bank. And on one side, we've got all these community organisations doing incredible, important work in the world who are looking for volunteers. And then there's this massive portion of the community who are looking to volunteer. And somehow, we've got to build the bridge between the 2. Does that make sense? Cool. So, I look at volunteer recruitment in 2 different ways, passive and active. So passive, this is where you put the call out and you wait for the people to come. You've seen this a million times, right? Joan goes, oh, I'll make a flyer. And she makes a flyer and she puts all this time and effort in, and Bob says, oh, change the colour of the heading, that's the wrong font. You know, and we put all this effort in, we make this flyer, we trudge down to the local IGA notice board, we put it up on the notice board, we go to Woolies, we put it up on the notice board, and then we sit by the phone and we wait for it to ring. And we're pretty damn sure that was the best flyer we've ever made, and it was so beautiful. And then the phone never rings. And what happens? We get disappointed and we get demotivated and we start thinking no one cares. And then that hits us deep in the heart in the issues that we care about, and eventually, you know, that piles on and we no longer have a sustainable organisation. So what I promote is active. And this is where you initiate the conversation and you take the opportunities as they arise. And I guarantee you the return on investment for your time and your energy is so worth it. It just takes a little more pre-planning at the start. So here's just a little hot tip. So we can find people locally, and lots of organisations, this is the path they go down. We want to find the residents and the workers from our local neighbourhood. That's who we want to get on board. There's another whole untapped resource in there, which is this regional recruitment. This is people who have an affiliation with your area or your institution or your organisation. They might have grown up there, they might have gone to school there, maybe they take holidays there. We are not tapping this space enough, and it's a gold mine. And once you set up a strategy to start tapping into this, the volunteers come, the donors come out of the woodwork. It's amazing what happens when you connect to people who are broader than your initial local audience. So this is like behaviour change in one sentence. Behaviour change is a whole big, area of interest, but essentially you just got to ramp up the benefits and decrease the barriers. And the best way to do that is through your program design. So, are there any salespeople in the room? What do we call a barrier in sales? An objection, right? So we don't want to have our barriers become objections, because if they stick around long enough and they become objections, that's when the person who's asking the person to volunteer is getting a no, I can't because. And so that individual person has to respond to that. So we want to, where possible, build it into our programs. So let's have a look at the top barriers to volunteering. Don't have time. No surprises here. This is always the top one. So what can we do in our programs to make sure that we can overcome this barrier? Well, the second one is unable to make a long-term commitment. So we can have a variety of asks. We can ask people for a shorter-term commitment. We can ask them to come and just have a go. We can give them a succinct task. Instead of trying to recruit our treasurer, let's just recruit someone to take a look over the books. Instead of recruiting a secretary, we might be able to recruit someone to review our minutes template. So starting with a bite-sized chunk. Prefer to give money instead of time? Yeah, we love this, right? Why this is important is that a lot of the organisations that I work with don't actually make it easy to give them money. And I know many people are kind of like, what? Of course. But have someone external to your organisation audit to see how easy it is to give you money. And you'll be surprised. You want someone external to have a look. So whether this is, your donation button on Facebook, or a really clear donation button on the website, or, a tin can at the front desk, whatever it is, you want it to be easy to give you money. So when they want to give money instead of time, they have that opportunity. No one asked. This is one of those scenarios where the cavern seems so deep. We feel like we've asked 100 times and we feel like we've got 200 no's back. But then there's these people kind of standing there going, I really want to contribute, but I don't think they want me because they're not asking. And so we need to ask and ask and ask and ask again. And maybe by the time we get sick of our own voice or feel like we're asking too much is about the time the ask lands and the people hear it. This is mindset stuff, right? We feel like it's just always asking and they can't hear our ask. So had no interest. My philosophy here is don't try to convert the uninterested. You want to find the people who have a spark of interest and you want to activate them. You want to inspire them to engage. But you know what? You can't spend your time trying to convince people. And we have learnt this so clearly from watching what has happened on social media. Like there's just some comments you can't respond to. It's okay to just move on. Health problems or physically unable. I've had an organisation who's gone to a part of their program being digitally based volunteering to account for this group of people who they discovered were there and had a close affiliation with their organisation, but weren't able to easily leave their homes. Did not know how to become involved, so this is back to the ask, right? These are in order of frequency of being heard, and gave enough time already. This is back to the same old story. So yes, we have community members who volunteer, and if you already volunteer, you're twice as likely to volunteer for another organisation, but there's a point. And we need to be careful to, hold people and not have them go over that point, because burnout is ugly and it's not good for any of us. So if people are kind of taking on more than they can, sometimes we can gently support them to step back. Financial cost of volunteering. There's more and more grants happening around this space now to reimburse volunteers for the costs. A lot of this is associated with travel or purchasing things. Dissatisfied with previous experience. So this is quite low, it's like 7%. But the interesting thing here is that when we're asking someone to come and volunteer with us, they're hearing that ask from their own perspective, from all of their previous experiences. So you might be just saying, hey, we just need a committee member. We're not asking you to be the president, we just need a committee member. But the previous committee they've sat on, there's been meetings that always run till midnight. And so in their head, all they're hearing is you say, come and sit with us in a 5-hour meeting every second week where Joan is going to talk like this on and on and on, and no matter how many times you try to leave, they tell you you can't leave, and you go home tired and the next day you're cranky for work. So we need to be aware of this when we ask people to volunteer and be really clear about what we're asking and really tighten up those meetings. Cool, so a few small tweaks make a difference, and a step-by-step planned approach makes a massive difference. And we want to start to treat recruitment like a campaign in itself. You can do recruitment ad hoc, but you're just not going to get the return on investment of if you take a step back. So here's the model that I put together. This is the 5A model of volunteer recruitment. For 10 years, I trained a different model, and just in the last 12 months, I updated it. And this is the most successful volunteer recruitment training I've delivered. It's my most requested topic. So I train community groups and not-for-profits a lot around Australia and internationally, and this is always the hot one. So here's how it goes. The first step is activity, audience, ask, action, and allies. And I am going to give you the super quick version. But I think we have the slides available. If not, just flick me an email and I'll send them to you. So activity. This is step 1. This is about figuring out why you're recruiting, because you can't begin to bring people on until you know exactly what you're recruiting for. And this whole we just need more people to distribute the workload, it doesn't actually work. So we want to get super specific. We want to look at, are we recruiting people for an activity, for tasks, or for roles? And sometimes we need to question the roles. So for example, a secretary role is bloody daunting, right? It's huge. And it's no wonder that people don't want to step up for them because, Paul's got this room full of paperwork piled up on the floor. And what's going to happen when you become the secretary? All that paperwork is going to come to your house and you're going to have to do things the way he does them. It's super daunting. But we can break these roles up. Maybe we're just looking for someone to take the minutes at meetings. Maybe we just need to start with, having someone to type up handwritten notes. We can break roles down into manageable tasks that make them more appealing to people. So audience, once we know exactly what we're recruiting for, that's when we can start. And we might look at who might be the likely audience for this type of role. So in that scenario, we're looking for a secretary. Maybe we are going to look for a retired bookkeeper. Maybe we're going to look for a student who's studying communications. But looking at the roles, the tasks, and thinking then about the groups or the types of people that might be willing to do that. So then we get to the ask. And this is where we want to make it super individual. We want to aim to have one-on-one conversations, because otherwise we're just passive, right? We're just putting the call out there, waiting for the phone to ring, and wondering why it never does. This is about getting direct. If you're looking for a treasurer's role and you think an accounting student might be a great fit, then go to the university, talk to the lecturer, see what opportunities there might be to align with those students. There's also a psychology of an ask. Like what's bubbling behind the ask when we ask? Because often when I go into organisations and I work with them, I discover that that ask is coming from a place of the 100 no's that we've got before. So if you're asking someone to volunteer but you don't believe they're going to, because you're still stuck in all those no's, how does that sound? The person that you're talking to, how do they hear that? They hear that you're not confident. And that confidence behind our ask is everything. We want to be confident, clear, concise, and common. This is coming back to the you ask and ask and ask and ask and ask and ask. And by the time you get sick of your own voice, that's about the time it starts landing. So then, action. The first action of new volunteers is critical. So the very first thing that they do is what will make the difference between whether they're there next week and next year. I've seen this happen. This is a true pattern. We recruit a volunteer and then we say, oh, we'll just let them observe for a week or two. And they come along and they watch this happen over there and they watch that happen over there, and they might ask some questions and they're trying to learn what's expected of them. But they walk away and they go, oh, there's not an urgency for me to be there. They don't really need me. So we want to make sure that on that very first contact, they're doing a task, that they can walk away and feel a sense of achievement, feel like they mattered, feel like it means something for them to be there. What will they give and what will they gain? Approach it from that space, because it's a two-way conversation. It's not just that they come to volunteer and we get all the gain. People get a lot from volunteering. And that is a common thing. You know, we hear like the flagpole things of, volunteering's good for your health and all of this sort of stuff. But it's actually embedded in truth. People feel good for volunteering. I actually wrapped up toilet paper like this and dropped it on someone's doorstep the other day who had put out in the local group that they had none. And I cannot tell you, it was the best feeling of giving I have had since the fires, when a bunch of local people and I filled up a car and drove it down and just gave a woman who'd lost everything and her child, you know, toys of his favourite kids' Toy Story thing. Like, that feeling is real. That sustains us as humans long term. And it is so, so valuable. So we want to be able to communicate that to people, but without being like, this is what it makes you feel. We need to let them feel that for themselves. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. We're almost there. Allies. So I don't talk volunteer retention anymore, I talk allies. What we want to do is think about the lifetime value of a supporter or a volunteer and how having allies benefits the organisation in much larger ways than simply volunteer retention. Because the reality is sometimes it just naturally comes to an end. And we fight and say, oh, we've got to retain our volunteers, we've got to retain our volunteers, and oh, look at the stats dropping off. But like, it's okay. People's life experiences change, their circumstances change. And we can become okay with letting people go when things have naturally run their course. And maybe if they leave with a really great feeling, they still love the organisation. Maybe they contribute in a new way. Maybe they're a donor. Maybe they come back to you later in life. But it's about shifting that model of like retaining them at all costs and just going, it's cool. Things naturally shift and we're going to roll with that, but we're going to engage them as allies throughout their life. That was the super quick version. This is like a full day training that I have condensed down. But you have what you need there to kind of look with a new lens at your volunteer recruitment and see what you can tweak and change. I have just put this course online, and so I do have a conference special where you can have a 50% discount for lifetime entry into any of my online courses. I've found that I've been travelling a lot over the last couple of years, and so I've decided to put my trainings online. And so if you use that Collins & Co coupon code at checkout, you get 50% off. So it makes it like the volunteer recruitment training is $97, so it makes it like, I don't know, 46 bucks. And then there's another Leadership Academy, Community Leaders Academy that I'm launching in 2 weeks. It's just trialling with one of the local councils now, and that's $997, so you can get into there for lifetime for half price in this initial stages. Cool, so I want to leave you with one thought. As Australia started to go seemingly batshit crazy over toilet paper in the last couple of weeks, and I put bows around those toilet papers and I dropped them off at that stranger's doorstep, I had this realisation that the good thing about bad things is that they give optimum opportunity for kindness to rise. This is when we see the best in humanity. And so I think that we can shift to a focus of really the good in all of these bad situations. And if we can be those beacons of light within our community groups and within our organisations, that is the light that you can hold that will help those volunteers that are looking for something to give their time, passion and energy to find the bridge that goes over that river and makes its way to your organisation. That's it, we got there.